Coming in YouTube, getting ready to start my show, Jimmy Rants. Looks like Facebook does what it does from time to time, and it just did not like going live. So we're going to try it again over on Facebook. Bear with me just a second. Thanks for being here today. See if we can get this show on the road over on Facebook. And give me just a moment here. We'll get this show started. We're getting ready to start my show, Jimmy Rants, over on Instagram, so get ready, get ready. And we're gonna add a description over on Facebook, see if we can go live now. Come on in, Facebook, getting ready to start my show, Jimmy Rants. We're already live over there on YouTube, where Shirley said hello. Hello, Shirley, thanks for always being one of my first ones. I love my super fans. There's maybe like a dozen of you that are always here. Hello, RJB, or PJB, sorry, from Houston, Texas. Hello, Norma. Speaking of one of my normal people, you can't spell normal without Norma. So it is not normal until Norma shows up. How do you like that, Norma? But yeah, I have a great study to go over today on Jimmy Rants that I think if you're into ketogenic diets, you will find quite interesting. It's a very long study, so I'm gonna try to zip through it as good as I can without watering down what it says. So I think you're gonna like this one here today. So looks like we need to get started here in just under a minute, but thank you for being here today. I had a funky kind of sleep last night, so I went to bed. I usually am a very early to bed guy, so it was like 7:15. Hello, Deborah, thanks for being here from Ohio. It was about 7:15 when I got into the bed, probably around that time that I fell asleep as well. Hello, Harpsy. Hello, Kay. Hello, Herbie. So I got to sleep, and then around 8:45, I heard this loud boom outside. Now, you never know what that is when you hear a boom, and I'm right next to a street where there's a lot of cars that come by. And sometimes when big trucks come by and they don't see that little hole in the road, it goes, you know, makes a loud noise. Maybe that's what it was. All I know is I was wide awake. So I finally got back to sleep around 10:30. And those of you that know me well. I'm up super early, like sometimes 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Today, it was 6:30 before I got up. So my day has been so thrown off, it's not even funny. I literally just got done with my chores with the chickens and the cats and having breakfast. Usually I've done that hours ago by now. So thank you for being here. We're gonna get this show on the road, and here we go. There's a new study out that says lowering saturated fat actually led to an increase in carbs and thus heart disease. Find out the details here today on Jimmy Rants. Click on that little box down there in the corner. It'll take you straight to IGTV for today's episode. JimmyRants.com is the website, and as always, you can engage live in the content. Go follow me. I'm over on Instagram. I am at Livin' Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you're there, engage live in the content, and we are here Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. I kind of like slurred that a little bit. Maybe I need to drink this early in the morning or something, but no, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday is when I'm here. Thank you guys for being here. We also simulcast over here on my Facebook page where David just popped in to say hello. Thanks for being here, you guys, as well as over on my YouTube channel, which for some reason, YouTube has just grown exponentially as of late. So thank you to everyone who's brand new to the YouTube channel, and I appreciate your support over there on the live stream. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay right here on Instagram, IGTV. As soon as this is over, it goes right up to Instagram. We'll put it right up there so you can watch it on replay, where a lot of people do watch the replay. So thank you if you're watching this on replay. You can also watch the replay over on YouTube. Just type in a keyword, Jimmy Rants. Today, you guys, on the Livin' La Vida Low Carb Show, my big flagship podcast, almost 1,700 plus episodes now. You can actually listen to a best of Jimmy Rants. So today we have where I went over the research that my friend Amber O'Hearn had about the carnivore diet and whether or not you can get all the essential nutrients in your diet just eating animal food. So go listen to that. If you missed that Jimmy Rants, you can go listen to it on the Livin' La Vida Low Carb Show, LLVLC.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And then finally, the official website for this show, jimmyrants.com. You can see all the past episodes there. And while you're there, you can actually support my work if you like, where I share about studies and share about things in the culture. I love doing this show, but I would love to have your support if you get value out of it. So throw me a little change either through PayPal as a one-time donation, or you can become a Patreon, and any amount would be greatly appreciated. Okay, you guys, I want to talk about a study today because in the 1980s, which I was a child of the 1980s, we were told that the biggest enemy in our diet when it came to being healthy, and specifically heart healthy, was saturated fat. We were told that anything that contained saturated fat was going to clog your arteries, was going to lead to a heart attack, and that you would die. And they struck the fear of God in people like my mom, who bought into the low-fat lie, hook, line, and sinker. And of course, those of you that are of a certain age, my age and older, you remember those days. You remember how fat was so vilified. It led to a whole line of products that were fat-free, and they take the saturated fat out. A lot of people, a lot of the kids these days don't realize McDonald's French fries, for example, used to be cooked in lard. But today they're cooked in vegetable oils because of this fear of saturated fat. So what happened when we cut saturated fat out of the diet? What happened? And a lot of people think, oh, okay, it had to make us healthier, right? Like the stated purpose of cutting saturated fat, its sole purpose was to improve your risk of cardiovascular disease, heart disease, higher cholesterol, which we know leads to heart disease, all these things we believed. Well, it didn't take a brain surgeon to figure this one out. When you cut down on one of the major macronutrients, fat, and you really can't eat but just so much protein. Protein is almost self-limiting. You really can't get too much of it. Your body just won't let you eat a lot of it. What is left? What is left is carbohydrates. And something else that happened when they were recommending people cut their saturated fat, guess what they were also telling people to do as a positive thing in their diet? Oh yeah, eat more healthy whole grains. And I even remember as a kid, not just eat more whole grains, it was eat more carbohydrates because you need them for energy. So here we have a perfectly healthy food in saturated fat. People obediently cut them down. We have all the statistics that show when they recommended in the dietary guidelines for Americans in 1980 that people cut their saturated fat intake, people obediently did it to the point of today, there's 23%, we're eating 23% less saturated fat today than we were when the dietary guidelines came out. And so people are following the guidelines. But what happened was people were fooled into thinking carbohydrates were benign in their health. And what we're now learning, thanks to a new study, is that decision to get people to cut saturated fat and increase carb consumption actually increased heart disease. Heart disease, COVID-19 or otherwise, heart disease is still the #1 killer of men and women in America. Has nobody ever stopped to ask why? Have we wondered why 600,000 people are dying of heart disease, and it's rapidly rising? It's going to be a lot more than that probably this year because of stress and the junk food diet. Nobody ever asked this question. Why are people dying of heart disease? Well, this study I'm about to read to you here today is going to give you some clues. So yes, if you're just joining us, I'm going to go over a study here today. This was just published on September the 10th. So this is hot off the presses, just last Thursday. It's out of Cambridge University Press on behalf of the Nutrition Society. And a lot of times when I read from these studies, people are like, where's the link? And well, I can't link it in a vocal video show like this. So pay attention to the title if you want to get a copy of this. It's a very lengthy study, but it is all available, what's called open access online if you want to go look it up. Here's the title. If you Google this or you DuckDuckGo it, don't Google it. DuckDuckGo it, Bing it, just anything but the G word. Look it up. Here it is. Intake of carbohydrates and SFA stands for saturated fatty acids, and the risk of CHD, which stands for coronary heart disease, in middle-aged adults. And it's called the Hordaland Health Study, HUSK, H-U-S-K. So we're going to go over the HUSK study here today because this is so critically important to explain why the unintended consequences of telling people cut your saturated fat actually led to something far worse than saturated fat ever was in our health. Like, if you still fear saturated fat, I'm going to recommend two really nerdy books to you. The first one is called Good Calories, Bad Calories. It's by Gary Taubes. It came out in 2007. It was the seminal book, and it's very scientific, so work through it as best as you can. But if you want to get the history of how we got into the mess with saturated fat, believing it was somehow an enemy in our health, read Good Calories, Bad Calories. Again, came out 13 years ago, but is still prescient to this day. Now, one came out about 4 or 5 years later by Nina Teicholz called The Big Fat Surprise. Now, Nina's a little more consumer friendly in her writing style than Gary Taubes is, but she went over a lot of the history as well, brought out some things that Gary punch when it comes to learning about why saturated fat is not the enemy in your health. And it also explains what this study is about to explain, how cutting saturated fat actually led to an increase in carb consumption, which then raised heart disease risk. Okay, let's get back to the study. So in the abstract, the objective was limiting saturated fat intake may minimize the risk of cardiovascular disease. However, such a reduction often leads to an increased intake in carbohydrates. We wanted to evaluate the associations and the interplay of carbohydrate and saturated fatty acids on heart disease. So it's what's called a prospective cohort study. So cohort study, just imagine it's like an observational study, which I'm not a big fan of in general, observational studies, but when you're looking at data and you're trying to come up with kind of a theory, it's a good theory producing way to come up with something to test in a randomized controlled trial. That's what they're doing in this, which is why this is important. Okay. The study followed participants in the Hordaland Health Study, Norway from 1997 to 1999, all the way through 2009. So they wanted to see what did the participants eat during that period of time in the late 90s, and then they followed them for a full 10 years after that to see what happens in their health. They had all the information on carbohydrate and saturated fat intake. They got it from an analysis as continuous and categorical quartiles variables. So I think what they did was they had them check in like once a quarter and, okay, what are you eating? So it's a little bit kind of tricky when you start saying, okay, what did you eat for the last 3 months? But it's better than no data at all. Theoretical substitution analysis modeled the substitution of carbs with other nutrients. Coronary heart disease was defined as fatal or non-fatal, looking at the various ICD codes. So they wanted to see, did people get CHD? And then if they did get it, did they die from it? All right, so how many people were involved? 2,995 men and women between the ages of 46 and 49. So that's my age group. We're not talking about older people. We're not talking about younger. We're talking about very much middle-aged people. So what were the results? Adjusting for age, sex, energy intake, physical activity, and smoking, saturated fat was associated with a lower risk of heart disease. Did you get that? How many people, so-called health experts today, still think saturated fat is the enemy in your heart? You go to the American Heart Association website right now. Well, not right now because you're watching Jimmy Rants, but when this is over, go look up on the American Heart Association website what they think about saturated fat. They still, to this day, think that saturated fat's the great boogeyman in your heart health. They think saturated fat is the causal factor in heart attacks, heart disease, and all the rest. But this paper says they looked at the analysis and saturated fat was associated with a lower risk of heart disease. For carbohydrates, guess what happened, guys? Look at this. The opposite pattern was observed. In other words, carbohydrate consumption was the thing that raised cardiovascular risk. And people are just flabbergasted. Oh, I thought that fat was what clogged the arteries. I ate the fat and went right to the arteries and just clogged it up. And they don't understand that that's not the way the body works. The way the body works is the body has to be inflamed. Well, what's inflaming the body the most? It's two things primarily. Carbohydrates, yes, and then the other thing that they don't talk about in this paper, which I wish they would, is vegetable oils. So the seed oils are highly inflammatory. Carbohydrates, especially the refined kind, are highly inflammatory. And it's that inflammation that gets into the coronary arteries. And when you are inflamed, guess what comes to put out the fire of inflammation in the body? It's the body's firefighters, also known as cholesterol. So when you see clogged arteries with this yellow gunky stuff, people just think, oh, that must have been fat. No, that's the firefighters trying to put out the fire that those carbs and vegetable oils caused. Are you seeing why there's such a disconnect between what's actually happening and this narrative that's been put into our heads that saturated fat is clogging arteries? It never was true. It's never been true. They've never proven it to be true, and yet most people still walking around today think that it's absolutely true. Saturated fat from cheese was also associated with a lower cardiovascular disease risk, while there were no associations between saturated fat from other foods and heart disease. A substitution of carbs with total fat but not saturated fat was associated with lower cardiovascular disease. So if you get rid of carbs and you replace it with, say, monounsaturated fats from things like avocados, olive oil, avocado oil, those kinds of things, then you get a benefit. Well, that should tell you it's the carbs that are stoking the heart disease, not the fat. So their conclusions in the abstract: higher intake of predominantly high glycemic carbs and lower intake of saturated fatty acids, specifically lower from dairy, things like cheese, were associated with a higher heart disease risk. So when you cut your carbs or cut your fat, saturated fat specifically, and you raise your high glycemic carbs, which are really anything sugar, grain, starch, which is exactly what people did when they started following the dietary guidelines. They cut their fat obediently, and then they had to replace it with carbohydrates. They say that was what was associated with the highest level of heart disease. Do you think they did that on purpose? Like, to what end would they have of doing this without any good science that supported them doing it? Now, they pretended like the science was strong, but the science was never, ever there. And yet it pervaded. And yet it pervades to this day. Please go look up on the American Heart Association website what they say about saturated fat. It will boggle your mind that in 2020, one of the major organizations about cardiovascular health still thinks that saturated fat is somehow an enemy. How? Why? Are they that stupid? Because we have too much evidence to the contrary. Substituting carbs with total fat but not saturated fat was associated with significantly lower risk. So point is, when you have the carbs in the diet, that led to higher heart disease risk. When you cut the carbs out and you replaced it with any kind of fat, it led to lower risk of heart disease. So that's the abstract, guys. Let's get into the dirty details. And like I said, this is a very long study. I'm going to try not to get lost in the weeds of it, but I want you to see some of the nitty-gritty of this. And if you're just joining us, yes, there is a brand new study just came out last Thursday, and it was published, the Cambridge University Press published this on behalf of the Nutrition Society. The name of the study, which I see my friend Kira over here gave a link on Facebook. For those of you that are over there, you can click on it. But intake of carbohydrates and SFA and risk of CHD in middle-aged adults. It's called the Hordaland Health Study, HUSK study. All right, so let's get into it. And Joshua is previewing what is here in the introduction with his comment, a charismatic Ansel Keys was a factor. He was a big factor. And his study, which I've talked about ad nauseum on Jimmy Rants before, his study of 7 countries showing a correlation between saturated fat intake and cholesterol and thus heart disease risk was 7 countries. When they had a data point of 26 countries, they threw out the ones they weren't interested in that didn't support the hypothesis. Okay, introduction. According to Ansel Keys' diet heart hypothesis, a habitually high intake of saturated fat may increase the risk of coronary heart disease due to increases in your total cholesterol. Minsink and Katan published a meta-analysis back in 1992, including 27 controlled trials, concluding that the most favorable lipoprotein profile for CHD, coronary heart disease, was achieved as saturated fatty acids were replaced by unsaturated fatty acids, keeping the intake of total fat unchanged. So what they did in the 1992 study was they said, okay, if you're going to eat fat, cut out the saturated fat, but just replace it with things like monounsaturated and even some polyunsaturated fats. That was what they concluded. The discovery of the additional pathways leading from diet to heart disease has made the diet heart hypothesis a lot more complex. Advice to reduce saturated fat as a means to prevent heart disease may have indirectly increased the intake of carbohydrates. While carbohydrates have been considered the basis of a healthy diet, with grain products at the base of the food guide pyramid, a diet rich in added sugars and refined grains promotes visceral adiposity, which is belly fat, and reduces energy expenditure, raising concerns of the potential for an increased risk of heart disease. On the other hand, if dietary carbs are replaced by fat, the postprandial rise in blood glucose, that's the after eating rise, and insulin decreases while glucagon secretion increases, which will lower your cardiovascular risk. I love the fact that they're bringing in the hormonal connection here. Because a lot of times when we look at studies looking at saturated fat, and especially the ones that try to make saturated fat the boogeyman, they never talk about the effects of insulin. They never talk about the effects of glucagon. They never look at blood sugar. Guys, they can't. If they bring these elements into the conversation, they've lost the cause, because those things would go all wackadoodle. And yet, this study is like, oh yeah, they're important. Among adults with obesity, another researcher named Hall found that restriction of dietary fat was associated with a slightly larger body fat loss than the restriction of carbohydrates. Also, of 29 diets with different macronutrient compositions in mice, only high-fat diets led to overconsumption and weight gain. So we know some of that research is out there where they claim that consuming excess amounts of fat is what leads to obesity and disease, and not carbs. So they're just acknowledging some of that research that's out there. A review indicated that greater high glycemic index carb intake was associated with the highest risk of heart disease compared with the greater increases in saturated fat. Furthermore, recent prospective studies and reviews, as well as various meta-analyses, have shown inconclusive associations between self-reported intake of either saturated fat or carbohydrates and fatal and non-fatal. In other words, they're kind of doing a damnation on some of these surveys. Like, I mean, how hard is it to check in with people on a daily basis, especially now? How hard is it to give them an app where they just say, okay, type in what you ate today, and that's it? And then the researcher has access to that. They can run all the analysis of what the macronutrient breakdown is, and they could do it. Now, this was in the late 90s when they were doing this research, looking at that, and then they did the follow-up in 2009. This is how research works, guys. It's very slow. They're looking at data usually from a historical perspective and then try to make a new study out of it, which is what this is. But if they did that today, you guys, it would be so stupid easy to just give them an app. I just concluded a study using the Oura Ring that was looking at my symptoms for COVID-19. I just finished that study. I was involved in that study for about 4 months. And on a daily basis, I checked in, do you have any symptoms? And it gave a list of symptoms. You clicked on the ones you had. Went to the next screen, have you been tested for COVID-19, yes or no? And you click the yes or no. And then it goes to the next screen, what's your current temperature? And you would put it in, and then you'd submit. And that I did that on a daily basis for 4 months. How hard would it be for people to say, oh, I had a chicken breast, I had broccoli, and I had a piece of bread, da-da-da. And then they could do all the analysis back at the lab, but it would be a lot easier to obtain that. But the problem that they're pointing out in this is usually they give them the survey. All right, tell us how many steaks you've eaten in the last 3 years. Okay, tell us how much bread you've consumed in the last 3 years. And it's like people can't remember, they will guesstimate. So there is a flaw in the data because of that. Given all these inconsistencies in the literature, the objective of this study was to evaluate the associations of carbs and saturated fat with heart disease in a sample of middle-aged community-dwelling Norwegians. Now, keep in mind, the totality of the nearly 3,000 people in this study were all Norwegians. This isn't Americans, this isn't people in Asia, this isn't Australia, this is just people in Norway. And so we need to keep that in mind as well as we look at the data. In Norway, the intake of carbohydrate varies from 21% to 74% of the energy percentage intake. The average is 49%. So their average is nearly half of their diet comes from carbohydrate. And the saturated fat varied from 4 to 25%, with the average being 13%. So where they were in this study, almost half, 49%, ate carbohydrate as part of their diet, and 13% of their diet was saturated fat. Okay, so again, like I said earlier, this is a prospective cohort study of participants in the HUSK study, which if you want to look up the HUSK study, they have a website here. You can look it up, HUSK, HUSK-en.w.uib.no, husk-en.w.uib.no. You can see all about the Hordaland Health Study, HUSK study, on that website. So they recruited based on a cohort, 1992 to 93, and 1997 to 99, all living cohort members born 1950 to 51, residing in the city of Bergen or the neighboring municipalities were invited to participate. The baseline examinations for the study were conducted in the years 1997 to 1999. They collaborated between the National Health Screening Service, which is now the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, the University of Bergen, and local health services. The participation rate was 77%. So of the people they chose, over 3/4 of them decided to participate, which is great. Participants underwent a brief health examination. They had a non-fasting blood sample. Information on their lifestyle was collected via questionnaires. A semi-quantitative FFQ was completed by 87% of the participants. So this is the people who filled out some of the information that would be used as the data in the study. 87% is a strong response. A total of 3,107 participants between the ages of 46 and 49 who answered these questions were eligible for the study. They excluded 22 men and 5 women who reported having heart disease previous to the study, 4 men and 19 women because they were missing information about them. They also excluded 27 men, 35 women who reported extreme energy intake. They were eating, no lie you guys, for the guys, almost 5,000 calories. So they're like, no, we don't want you in the study. You're abnormal if you're eating 5,000 calories. And for the women, it was nearly 3,000 calories, which they said was above the 99th percentile. So the final population of the study was 2,995. All right, so then they looked at the dietary assessment. Information on food intake was obtained at baseline, again, 1997 to 99, using a 169-item past year semi-quantitated FFQ, a slight modification over the previous one. So, literally, you guys, They gave them a list of 169 questions. And they said, okay, over the past year, have you consumed, and how much of the things have you consumed of this? Now, I've taken part in those kinds of surveys before, by the way. I was on, for many years, I was on this national weight registry study where they would like follow people that lost over 100 pounds and then see what they're eating now and what their current weight is and blah, 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 trying to make associations between what keeps weight off once people lose weight. And I remember they would send it once a year, and they would literally have this kind of a questionnaire where they'd have, okay, how many servings of meat did you eat per week over the past year? I'm like, how am I supposed to quantify that? Unless I'm a nerd, an engineer that has like a spreadsheet, how would I like possibly know? Now it would be easy because that's literally all I eat is animal-based foods. Well, let's see, I had 2 steaks today and I had 3 yesterday and 2 we're just gonna say 2 a day. Okay, so that would be 15 or 16 a week. That would be so easy today. But yeah, I mean, these are the kinds of things that just trying to get people to rack their brains of what they ate. Can you remember what you ate a month ago? Most people, unless you eat a very monolithic diet, most people can't. And yet that's one of the flaws of doing these kinds of studies. All right, so they handed out this FFQ, which is again this questionnaire, on the day of the health examination, filled it out at home, returned by mail. It includes frequency alternatives from once a month to several times a day, the number of units eaten of various foods, portion sizes, to capture all the habitual diets during the past year. It's presented as individual food and beverage items, food groups, and nutrients. Daily nutrients were computed from a database and software at the University of Oslo in Norway. The nutrient database primarily based on the official Norwegian food composition table. I'm not going to bore you too much with some of this, but basically what they looked at was some of the factors that were involved. So when they were collecting the data, by the way, this is an interesting side note they're saying in the study. During 1997 to 99, margarine was undergoing rapid compositional changes where large amounts of the trans fatty acids, an important contributor to unsaturated fat, were being reduced because of legislation. We had the same thing happening here in America, where they were so fearful of trans fats that they were removing it from all of these products. Furthermore, prospectively, there were other changes to unsaturated fat sources. Thus, unsaturated fat was not evaluated as a primary dietary exposure in the study. It's an interesting aside to remember that bit of history when we're looking at this. All right. Health examinations and health habits. Baseline examinations included height, weight, waist circumference, blood pressure, non-fasting blood samples. After at least 2 minutes of seated rest, they did their blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure measured 3 times, and then they got the average. Blood samples of total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and glucose were analyzed within 7 days. The Friedewald equation, which I've told you about before, I've written about quite extensively in my book, Cholesterol Clarity, which is here somewhere. There it is, Cholesterol Clarity. If you've read Cholesterol Clarity, then you know what the Friedewald equation is, but they used that equation in order to determine what the LDL-C number is. Information on educational level and medication was also self-reported. So they're being very thorough with the information. Hypertension, which is high blood pressure, was considered present if the mean of at least 2 consecutive measures was 140/90 or higher. Participants taking diabetes medications or reported having been diagnosed with diabetes were defined as having diabetes. This is an interesting one. We now know that type 2 diabetes, heart disease, to a lesser degree obesity, but it is included in that, some cancers, things like Alzheimer's disease, things like PCOS, we know all of those things are the same disease. We know they're all considered insulin resistance. And yet They didn't want anybody with heart disease, but they didn't mind taking people with high blood pressure, which is part of the metabolic syndrome. And they don't mind people having diabetes. If you have diabetes, you have a very high probability of getting heart disease. So I'm surprised they didn't parse that out in this study. Also, participants with a blood glucose level over 7 had not eaten a meal during the last 8 hours. 7 is the international one. I'm trying to do in my head what that would be. I can't do it real quick in my head, but I used to be able to do these numbers. I think 7 is like 125 blood sugar, roughly. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. Pre-diabetes, having glucose between 5, 6, and 7, da-da-da-da-da. Okay, participants answered one question on past year vigorous physical activity, resulting in sweating or shortness of breath. So they answered one question. How much vigorous activity, physical activity, have you had over the past year? Could you do that? You see how these studies are very difficult to conduct if you're not going to be meticulous in the day-to-day, or at least the very frequently, not asking once a year. It makes it difficult. Participants were either classified as non-smokers, former smokers, or current smokers, and they used non-smokers as the reference point. Okay. Outcome. The study endpoints were incident, first-time hospitalization with CHD, coronary heart disease, using ICD-9 codes 410 to 414 and ICD-10 codes of 120 to 125. That's just gobbledygook. Thank you, Becky. She said 7.0 on blood sugar translates into 146. I knew I wasn't doing that right in my head. On the fly, it's hard to know how to do that translation, but thank you, 146. So ICD codes are what doctors use to diagnose people with various things. So if somebody had a CHD diagnosis, it would be one of those codes I just mentioned. It has to be listed as either the primary or secondary diagnosis or death with CHD as an underlying cause of death. So yeah, when they do a cause of death, that's the problem with COVID-19 this year. They're putting COVID as like the primary cause of death, and then they would put like CHD, but it would still count in this. Sorry, yes, converted wrong, 126. So it is 126. Okay. I was close. I think I said 125. So, okay. So they followed them from baseline, which remember was from 97 to 99, all the way to December 31st, 2009, looking to see if any of them had a cardiovascular event that led to cardiovascular disease. There were 107 non-fatal and 5 fatal episodes. Follow-up time was calculated as time from participation until the time that they died, whichever occurred first, as far as like death from other causes or from CHD. So when they were looking at the statistical analysis, I'm trying to get through the weeds of this. Hang with me just a second. They accounted for adjusting for age and some of the other factors that we've talked about, smoking versus non-smoking. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds of all that. All right. Results. The characteristics of the study population. At baseline, the mean age was 48 years old. Their BMI average was 24.9. Just over a third of them smoked daily. 46% reported at least 1 hour of vigorous physical activity a week. That's a lot of people, almost half. And 1 in 4 had indications of reduced metabolic health defined as hypertension, prediabetes, or diabetes. Intake of total fat ranged from 14 to 53% of energy. The average was 33%. Carbohydrates averaged 49%. Less than 1 and 6% had an intake of carbs below 30 to 40%. So most of them weren't carbohydrate restricting, even at a very modest level. Intake of protein ranged from 6 to 30% with a median of 16%. That's kind of low as well. So you're seeing what's happening. They're not eating that much fat. They're not eating that much protein. What was left? What was left was the very thing that was making them less healthy, the carbohydrates. Less than 1% had an intake of saturated fat below 6%. So they didn't go super low in the saturated fat, but they weren't super high either. All right. So during an average of 10.8 years of follow-up, representing 32,449 persons years amongst 2,995 participants, which the breakdown, by the way, was 1,282 men and 1,713 women. They were documented 112 incidents of cardiovascular disease due to some missing values for smoking habits and physical activity. They had to adjust it to include 2,820 participants. Sorry about kind of all the numbers, but this is how these studies go. They want you to see we had this many people, but then we had this statistical abnormality, so we had to adjust the da-da-da-da-da. So I'm just trying to make sure you understand everything. 60% participants died due to other causes during the follow-up. When they evaluated the correlation between carbohydrates and the baseline, all the correlations showed that it increased cardiovascular disease. However, evaluation of baseline characteristics by quartiles of carbohydrate intake identified that the proportion of participants performing at least 1 hour of vigorous physical activity per week was higher in higher quartiles, while the proportion of the men, daily smokers, and participants with glucose intolerance were lower. In other words, you could mitigate a little bit of the effects of the carbohydrates if you did at least 1 hour of vigorous physical activity a week. And we know that because when you exercise, that actually uses up some of the glucose that is put into the body when you consume carbs. So that's not a surprise to me that you would mitigate it. Not completely mitigate it. Some people think you do completely mitigate it, but you don't. But it does blunt the effects. Okay. Intakes of total fat, protein, and alcohol were lower with high quantities of carbohydrate. Listen to what they ate as far as the carbs go. Bread was the major contributor to carbs. They ate a lot of bread. Intake, grams per day of bread, sweetened beverages, so that could be soda or really any sweetened beverage, juice, which is also a sweetened beverage, fruit and berries, both fresh and canned, was higher with higher quartiles of carbohydrate intake. There were less noticeable differences for other carbs among the quartiles. Vegetable and fiber intake were similar in the various carbohydrates. So, guys, look what they ate. Bread, sweet beverages, juice, fruit and berries. Are we surprised? That's what people turn to. And again, this is Norway. Can you imagine America? That would be not just bread. It would be honey buns, Little Debbie snack cakes, ding dongs, ho-hos, Coca-Cola. I mean, we could go down the list and make it very Americanized, but you can see when you cut fat in the diet, specifically saturated fat, which gives you such satiety, gives you such satisfaction in the foods, makes your hunger go away so that you're not hungry and not having to constantly feed the beast. You don't need to keep eating, but when you cut the fat, what do you have to do? You have to keep eating all those foods. All right, so let's keep going here. I hope this is fascinating info because when I saw this study, I was like, well, we kind of knew this, but it's nice to have a study that kind of codifies it. All right, the associations between carbs and saturated fat and the incident of coronary heart disease. Higher intake of carbs was borderline significantly associated with higher risk of heart disease. The association became stronger and significant after adjusting for smoking habits and physical activity. Also, a continuous analysis showed significant higher risk of coronary heart disease with higher intake of carbs. When you adjust for age, sex, energy intake, smoking habits, and physical activity, further adjustments for intermediate factors, relevant medications, and potential confounders did not materially influence the association. In other words, there's a very strong association that those people who get coronary heart disease, it's a direct result of not their saturated fat intake, but their carbohydrate intake. And again, this is not a surprise to us. We've been talking about this. I've specifically been talking about this for over 15 years. I wrote a whole book about how you want to deal with your heart disease risk. You don't need to be looking at the saturated fat. You need to be looking at the carbohydrate connection. It's so great to have some research that supports this. When examining the association between carbs from various foods, there were no associations with the risk of CHD. So they tried mixing it with other foods and it didn't change anything. So people are like, well, I'll eat some fat to blunt the effects of the carbs. I've heard that one too many times over the years. And I'm like, you want to do what? They want to eat their carbohydrates and they're like, well, we know saturated fat will blunt the blood sugar effects. And so therefore I'm going to eat saturated fat with the refined carbohydrates. I'm like, okay, if you're trying to speed up your death, you're doing a great job. No, that does not. And they just confirmed it in this study. It does not do anything of the sort. The highest intake of saturated fat was actually significantly associated with the lowest risk of cardiovascular disease, adjusting for age, sex, and energy intake. This association became stronger after adjusting for smoking and physical activity. All right. Are you guys getting the gist of this study? High carbs leading to higher levels of heart disease, higher saturated fat leading to lower levels of heart disease. This should be national news. This should be making all of the health websites. This should be on the front page of the American Heart Association. And yet they still have their head up their butt. Go look at the American Heart Association. I dare you to find something positive about saturated fat intake on their website. They're not interested. They want you to eat carbs because if you eat carbs, there's more heart disease. And if there's more heart disease, then there's an American Heart Association that can raise money for heart disease. We could eradicate heart disease if we got people to embrace a low carb, high saturated fat diet. We could very quickly turn that 600 to 700,000 people in America alone dying of heart disease. We could turn that around very quickly if everybody just embraced lower carb, definitely lower refined carbohydrate, higher saturated fat, but really any kind of real food-based fat diet. It would happen. All right, I don't want to bore you too much more. In the discussion, it says, in this community-based study population, high intake of carbs and low intake of saturated fat were associated with higher risk of incident coronary heart disease. Intake of saturated fat from cheese, they say, significantly was associated with a lower risk. When evaluating saturated fat intake after excluding cheese, it was a bit weaker, but it was still an improvement. The carbohydrates reflect a variety of sources coming from sucrose, which is like a simple sugar, fructose, and refined cereals, as well as whole grains, vegetables, and legumes. Refined carbs and added sugar accounted for the largest portion of carbohydrate intake in their diet. We want to talk about, well, we got rid of saturated fat and we replaced it with healthy whole grains. No, we did not. You can look at every box of cereal and it'll say made with 9 essential healthy whole grains. Well, guess what? Every one of them grains in there is refined. And yet people eat that stuff thinking, oh, I'm eating whole grains. No, you are not. Stop fooling yourself. Wake up to the marketing that has happened to you and realize that you've been fed a big pack of lies. And it's time we all speak up. Think about all the people who died of COVID-19 this year because their diet sucked. And it led them to have all those comorbidities, which was the thing that actually killed them. It breaks my heart because we've known this information for a very long time. This is not new. I've been shouting this from the mountaintop for over 15 years. When will people get it? When will we understand that it's not the fat that's the enemy in your health? It's all those carbs. Someday, guys, someday. Even today, very few Norwegians comply with the dietary recommendations. That sounds like America. Per capita sales indicate that sugar-containing foods and beverages peaked at the end of the 90s. Remember, the start of this study was in the late 90s, and they were eating more sugar than they ever had before. In addition, a nationwide diet survey among men and women 16 to 79 years old during that time found that their diet contained inadequate amounts of fiber and that the intake of added sugar was 10% amongst men and women. 10% of their diet was added sugar. When evaluating baseline characteristics in the cohort, the intake of fruits and berries, sugar-sweetened beverages, and juice doubled over the period of time that they were in the study. In contrast, intake of rice, pasta, flour, and cereals was modestly higher. Vegetable intake did not differ. Also, while recommended intake of fiber is out there, 25 grams for women at least, and 35 grams at least for men, the median intake was 24 grams, and that's what they ate. Trying to see if there's anything else interesting in here, because I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say. The main point here is they ate the way people ate, and they ate the way they were told to eat to be healthy, and thus they should have gotten healthier. Cut saturated fat, replace it with carbohydrates. That was supposed to make people healthier. That's what they told us here in America. And how many people got healthier? Cutting fat, cutting saturated fat, increasing healthy whole grains and carbs in general. How many people got healthier from that? Today, you guys, we have more heart disease, more obesity, more type 2 diabetes than we've ever had before. And it ain't by accident. The very things they said were going to make us healthy actually made us exactly not healthy. Okay, so let's see here. Some of the strengths and limitations of the studies. I think this is interesting. Strengths of the study include a community-based sample. So they did get a good kind of representative sample of the community. Only 60 participants died due to other reasons until 2009. So the people who died of coronary heart disease, I think they said was like 115, 120, whatever it was. 60 of them in the 3,000 died of other causes. Therefore, minimal competing risk for the cause of death. So if those people had anything wrong with their heart, it would have messed it up. But they died of things of other causes. They used information on health status, medication use, health habits, history of heart disease, blah, blah, blah. Limitations included the relatively small number of participants and events limiting the analysis. So they had 3,000 people involved. I wouldn't call that a small study, but if they had 30,000 people involved, it would have been a lot more significant results. Another limitation is the lack of information on possible changes of diet over time, medication changes, and other risk factors. That's true. When they looked at them at baseline from 97 to 99, that was a far different time in their life than in 2007, 8, 9, 10 years later, when maybe things had changed. Maybe they found this crazy diet called the Atkins diet in the mid-2000s and decided to do that. Maybe they went on a vegan diet and things radically changed. Who knows? You don't know in this study. There was also heavy recommendations during that time of reducing intake of saturated fat, increasing your intake of whole grains, intake of cooking oil, which is the vegetable oils, tripled from the late 1990s to about 2013. So they had higher levels of vegetable oil, which they did not ask them about in this study. I think that was a huge contributing factor to some of the deaths by coronary heart disease. Consumption of vegetables increased, intake of margarine and sugar-containing foods decreased over time. Blood samples were all non-fasting, so could they have made them fast and it would have been different changes that happened? Maybe. Postprandial triglycerides remained elevated for several hours. LDL also remained elevated. but it might have been underestimated. I often talk about when you eat keto and your triglycerides are under 100 and your HDL cholesterol is over 50, it can miscalculate your LDL on the high end. Well, when you do the opposite, when you have very high triglycerides and very low HDL, guess what? It can miscalculate it in the wrong direction for LDL for those people. So it underestimates it. It does. Other limitations, a large proportion, 75% of the participants, never ate a single bit of butter. 3 out of 4 of them didn't have any butter at all in their diet throughout the study. They claimed that that's likely a reflection of underreporting. So the results they got, you guys, might even be even more profound. Also, we do not have extensive information on carbohydrate quality, particularly bread, due to the lack of historical recipes, lack of food label details, and the type of carbohydrate content for the recipes from the database. Again, I think that would all be mitigated if they replicated this same kind of a study in 2020. I think with all the technology we have with apps now, it would be quite easy to follow those people on a daily basis and get a lot more precision. I honestly hope somebody does try to replicate this study, looking at, say, right now, and then looking at them 10 years from right now and doing the same thing. And people that would be willing to participate in a 10-year study, checking in on an app, you wouldn't have to pay them some money, but you could pay them some money. Say, hey, if you fill out your thing, we'll give you $5 a day. Who would not fill out for $5 a day? What's that, $150 a month? That'd be a lot of money. When we adjusted for estimated fiber from bread, vegetables, and fruit intake, total carbs remain a statistically significant predictor. So that's the bottom line, you guys, that I want to leave you with, that they looked at every angle of not just refined carbohydrates, but total carbs, even from the fruits and vegetables and grains and all the rest. And they found huge associations between the amount of carbohydrates that you consumed and your level and risk of heart disease. It went up. I just wish this would get out there in the mainstream, because the mainstream is still harping on how dastardly saturated fat is for you, and saturated fat is benign. And it actually leads to a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. I could go on and on and on, but the conclusion, the focus of the current study was to evaluate the importance of the interplay between saturated fat and total carbs, a high level of carbs reflecting low fiber and relatively higher levels of sucrose and fructose, and a low level of saturated fat was associated with the highest risk of cardiovascular disease, and substituting carbs with fat ended up in a lower risk of heart disease. So I hope you guys enjoyed that study. One more time, this was published September the 10th, 2020 in the Cambridge University Press. They published it on behalf of the Nutrition Society, and write it down if you want to look up this study. I didn't get a chance to go through all of it, but you got most of the gist of it. Intake of carbohydrates and saturated fatty acid, SFA, and risk of CHD, coronary heart disease, in middle-aged adults. It's called the Hordaland Health Study, HUSK study, and it was out of Norway. So go look it up. And I love bringing these studies to you guys. Sometimes I get a little bit nerdy, and I try to do my best to translate. That one was pretty easy. I've had a lot harder on Jimmy Rants to try to do in real time and explain them, but that was a really good one here today, and I hope you enjoyed that we now have a research study that shows cutting saturated fat actually led to a direct increase in carb consumption, which they find has the highest level of heart disease risk. Okay, let's see what you guys have to say. Going to come here first to Instagram, then over to Facebook, finally over to YouTube. Thank you all for being here today on Jimmy Rants. Let's see what you guys have to say. JimmyRants.com is the website. See what your reaction is to this particular study. We are still suffering today because of Ansel Keys Yeah, Heck, we sure are. And it's unfortunate because his study was flawed from the very beginning. It was never based on any kind of sound science. It was flawed from the very beginning. Becky says, absolutely agree. I love my high fat lifestyle. It just takes many advocates, and hopefully one day they see it as well. Yeah, I mean, I've been out here 15 years trying my desperately to just tell people get off the carbs, embrace real food, get the healthy fats that come with naturally with the proteins that you consume. Um, it's a major cultural shift to get people to get away from the packaged food model of consuming food. But that's why people hang on to it for so long. It's just so much easier. And if they knew real food could taste as good as it does, they would be doing it now. But the thing is, they don't know because it does take a little bit of work in the kitchen in order to get that food on the table. Too many of those damn underlying conditions that could have been prevented. Yes, Becky. Exactly. MHEC says, absolutely no science. I enjoy my high fats and I hope people see the light soon. Well, I'm going to keep squeaking my wheel. I might talk about other things besides diet in my work, but I'll always circle back around to if you shift your diet to mostly real whole foods, then you're going to be rewarded with really good health. You are. And the more research we have about it, just continues to reconfirm what I've suspected all along, not just in my own life, but in the lives of the people that I've taught over the years. M. Heck says, yes, the fast food industry, as well as the packaged food industry, has just made us crazy and lazy. Crazy and lazy. People don't want to put in the effort. I mean, and it's not hard to cook in the kitchen. Like, it's actually kind of fun to me to get in there and, all right, let's see what I can create with these real food ingredients. And it tastes 1,000 times better than anything you get in a packaged food. People don't realize how many preservatives they have to put in packaged foods just so they don't rot on the shelf. If your food doesn't rot in 2 weeks, then guess what? It's probably not real food. It's not. Pink Puggy Pundit, you always trip me up when you write. I wanted to mention David Diamond talks about this a lot. Yes, I have had David on the Living La Vida Low Carb show several times now. He had extremely high triglycerides, and it was kind of a genetic thing for him. And he went on a low carb diet and was able to shift his metabolic profile very rapidly. But yeah, David's a good friend of mine. We talk not real often, but often enough. And yeah, sweetheart of a guy too. Go look him up on YouTube. Has some really good talks all about this subject. So yes, thank you for bringing up David Diamond's name. All right, thank you, Instagram. Let's pop over here now to Facebook. What's up, Facebook? See what you guys have to say about this one. Tracy says, my mom got Raisin Bran only for us. She didn't want us eating the sugary cereal. What was funny is if you got, I think it was the Post Raisin Bran, they didn't put sugar on it, but if you got the Kellogg's Raisin Bran, even the little raisins had little sugar all pasted on it. So it was so weird. I liked the Post one, even though I was a sugar addict. It was too much sugar to add sugar to raisins and then also to the little bran flakes in the cereal, but that is funny. She didn't want me eating bacon and eggs, even though that's what I wanted. Well, now you can have all the bacon and eggs you want, right? Jenny says, interesting question about the purposefulness or not. Well, Jenny, I mean, I've been at this so long. How could they do this with such a lack of science? Like, what would have been the motivation? You know, and I hate being conspiratorial, but 2020 is the year of being a conspiracy theorist, so why not? I wonder if maybe the people that were developing the dietary guidelines in the late 70s leading up to 1980 when they came out with the first ones, did they talk to the food industry? Did they talk to the pharmaceutical industry and say, okay guys, we're about to remove the very thing that we know keeps people healthy. And we're about to highly, highly recommend the thing we know makes people get unhealthy. Get ready. You're going to have a lot of customers. You're welcome. Like, I don't want to think that that's how evil it could have been, but I wouldn't put it past them. Nope. Kay says bacon. I ate bacon a month ago. Yeah, I think we all did a little bit to a certain degree. Kira says, I think we need to educate our doctors. Sad that we have to, but it's up to us now. I am a layperson, and I've been educating so many doctors over the past 15 years. It's not even funny. And it's sad that it takes lay people to understand this. But I did interview Dr. Tony Hampton on Saturday morning. It's coming up soon on one of my podcasts, but I did interview Dr. Hampton, and I asked him about that, what's going on. He's like, look, doctors don't have time. They've got their patients to see. They just don't have the time to be looking things up and challenging and questioning their education. They got head down and just trying desperately to survive in the system. And I'm like, if the system is that busy, the system is broken. So, yeah, don't miss my interview with Dr. Tony Hampton coming up real soon. All right, thank you, Facebook. Let's pop over here now to YouTube, where it's always an adventure of what you guys have to share. I would think scientists would be relying on science, but I guess not, says Harp C. Why would you think scientists would rely on science? Don says the slow death from our diet became fast this year with COVID-19. Sadly, yes. I'm afraid you're right. People on their phone getting paid to report their food, such a great idea. I mean, I would do it. I would do it. It'd be easy for me. Now that we are beyond the fear of eating eggs, says Bill, there is confusion on which eggs are best. Oh, I'm not confused. Just eat eggs. Like, I have beautiful chickens in my backyard. 14 backyard chickens giving me around a half a dozen eggs a day. And obviously that's the highest quality eggs you can get. But just get eggs. Like, I'm not even worried about parsing out what kind of eggs, what kind of meat. If you get off the carbs, because this paper said nothing about that. This paper just said eating saturated fat and fat in general tends to lead to a lower level of risk of coronary heart disease, and higher levels of carbohydrate are leading to higher levels of coronary heart disease. Doesn't say anything in there about grass-fed, panda massaged meat. Doesn't say anything about making sure all your chickens are eating bugs and eating grass and they're able to pasture. None of that. Just get off the friggin' carbs. That's all it said. Well, I didn't say friggin' carbs. That's the Jimmy Moore translation. PJB says, I track my food so I could actually report my daily intake. Well, you're one of the few. That's what I'm saying. There are some people that are nerds like you that could do that, but most people could not. Shirley says, science, the thing people quote until it doesn't suit their narrative. Well, that's a whole nother story, Shirley, for a whole nother day. But yes, you are spot on. So guys, good news today. We have a new study that says cutting saturated fat actually had an unintended consequence. It made people eat more carbs, and by eating more carbs, it actually increased heart disease risk. We have more heart disease. It's the #1 killer in America than any other thing that's killing people. 700,000 people a year, and it keeps going up and up and up and up and up. When will enough be enough? We need the truth to get out there about what's causing it, and we now know, thanks to this new research, that it's the carbs and not the saturated fat. That's it for this episode of Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website, and as always, you can engage live right here. Instagram, follow me there. I'm at Living Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you're there, join us. We are here Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, so thanks for being here. We simulcast over here on my Facebook page as well as on my YouTube channel. Thank you all for being here today on Jimmy Rants. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay on IGTV. We also throw the past episodes up over on YouTube. Type in a keyword, Jimmy Rants. You will find the show. Today is Jimmy Rants Day on the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. So that's my flagship podcast, 1,700 episodes, longest running health podcast on the internet. Go check it out, llvlc.com, where I go over a study about the carnivore diet and the nutrient sufficiency of a carnivore diet. You won't want to miss that one. And then finally, pop over to the official website for this show. It is jimmyrants.com. While you're there, you can see all the past episodes, but it's your way of being able to show me support financially. You can do a one-time donation through PayPal, or you can join my Patreon. I got a lot of people very interested in being a Patreon, and I'm very grateful to everybody who sees the value in what I'm doing here in my work. So thank you so much, you guys. jimmyrants.com is that website. All right, guys, I'm out of here for now. We will see you again tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for more Jimmy Rants. Bye. All right. Well, thank you, guys. I do have an interview coming up at 1 o'clock. I'm glad Instagram lets me go over an hour now. When I first started doing the Instagram Lives, they wouldn't let you go more than an hour. It would start counting down at like 58 minutes. It would start counting down so you couldn't go past 60 minutes. Well, about a month ago, I guess, they started going beyond, because I was doing an Ask Me Anything on a Friday. Now I was just rolling along. Next thing I know, I look up and I see it's like after 12, and I'm like, wait a minute, it's still rolling. And so I don't know how long it goes now, but it's nice to be able, with, especially with these longer like studies, to be able to go a little bit longer than an hour. But thanks for hanging out. I do need to get out of here so I can prepare for that interview coming up at 1. But thank you for being here today, and we'll see you again soon. Bye, YouTube.